Okay, we're talking about the theory of evolution, which was around before Charles Darwin, and we're going to focus on how Charles Darwin came up with a mechanism to explain how evolution was happening, and he called that mechanism natural selection. So Darwin was a naturalist. He's famous for producing a book called The Origin of Species. He did a 5-year voyage of the Earth on a boat called the HMS Beagle, and he found himself in South America on the west coast. And he noticed, these are called the Galapagos Islands. He was noticing that on each island there were finches, but on each island the finches looked different. So he proposed this idea that the finches had come from the mainland and they'd flown to each island, and depending on what food source or what the environment was like there, different versions of the finch were successful depending on what island they're on. So, for example, you can notice this finch here looks this first one here looks very different from this one here, number 4. Much bigger beak. So perhaps when the finches were all looking quite similar at the beginning here, when they flew over, some of those finches might have had slightly bigger beaks, just slightly, so they were more likely to survive because the food source there was hard-shelled nuts or seeds, and if you've got a stronger beak, then you're more likely to get food. Whereas this one here, number 4, might be the result of, in island number 4, it was no benefit to have a big beak, so all the big beaked ones died off perhaps, and the ones with the small delicate beaks could get to the food sources, which might have been little cracks in the bark of a tree. So different selection pressures from the environment from these islands. So this is what helped him to come up with this idea of natural selection. And then we'll talk about fossil records and biological molecules as evidence to show that evolution is happening. So when Darwin went on his voyage, it soon became very apparent to him from his observations that offspring look similar to their parents, but the individual offspring aren't usually identical to each other. So there seems to be variation amongst the individuals. Organisms produce large numbers of offspring. However, the population sizes seem to remain stable, which tells us that some of those offspring are dying and a few are surviving. Why are some dying and some surviving? Well, this goes back to this second point, that the individuals are not identical to each other. There's something different about them. So this is what he said. To explain evolution by natural selection, the first thing that would have to be happening is there is variation within a population. And variation is caused by there being a lot of different alleles. So although they'll all have the same genes, the more different versions of the gene there are, the more different features they're all going to have. They're all going to have slightly different traits, physical traits, let's say, focus for now. So variation within a population. Now, the next thing that would have to have occurred was there would be a selection pressure from the environment. So if we go back to these islands here, each of these islands have a slightly different selection pressure. So the selection pressure could be the source of food. Some foods are hard to break the shells. Some food are hard to get to because they're hidden in tiny cracks. That would be one example. Lots of selection pressures could be the temperature, how much sunlight there is, the food sources, lots to have there. So selection pressure from the environment takes place. So some are going to die and some are going to survive. So who is going to survive? Those with the most suitable adaptations will survive. So where are their adaptations coming from? Having the most suitable adaptations is the same as saying they've got the most suitable alleles, because their alleles are what's causing their unique adaptations. So if they're most likely to survive, they are going to reproduce, and their alleles, or suitable alleles, passed on or passed down to their offspring. And if that happens enough, if that selection pressure is there for long enough, it's going to keep selecting those same suitable alleles over and over again until you end up with an island where what may have started off as all the finches looking quite similar with a bit of variation, now it's been selecting over and over again that each island has its own specific features that are suitable for that particular island. All right, so yeah, sometimes they use the term survival of the fittest. It's much better to say survival of those with the most suitable adaptations, or survival of those with the most suitable alleles. That's the best way to do it. Okay, so what evidence do we have to say that evolution is actually happening? Well, let's look at the fossils first. The fossils are telling us that different species existed in the past. And they tell us something else as well. New species appear similar to extinct species. So they're not completely different. There's some changes happening. And because we've got enough fossil evidence in different layers of the rock, and we can put an age on those layers of the rock, we can follow these changes happening. And some good examples, a really good one is the horse. We can show this is the modern horse now. As we go back further in time and we find fossils and layers of rock which go back further in time, we can see that the limbs have gone from being quite tall here, long here, to it's getting shorter, even shorter. And now we're starting to get these extra phalanges occurring, like toes. They're becoming even more pronounced, and the legs are getting shorter, which tells us that the modern horse has evolved from a much smaller, distant ancestor, a different species which no longer exists. And we can follow this line of change happening. So it's a different species, but there are a lot of similarities that we can still see. And the more extreme version is the whale. Remember, a whale is a mammal, and all mammals would have been on land. So this whale, it doesn't have any sort of gills. It has to hold its breath, and it comes up, gets air, goes down for a while, comes back up, and has to keep breathing that way. If you go back far enough, there's again fossil evidence that shows the changes. You can see an earlier ancestor, or if you look, this divergence here, this previous species here has got these little small legs left over from, if we go right back to the beginning here. So as you go back in time, the leg is getting longer. It's then starting to take on a better shape of something that would have been on land, until we go right back to this wolf-like anatomy. So again, another example of evolution, and just remembering this wolf-like organism, they wouldn't have all been clones of each other. There were subtle differences. Some were bigger, some were smaller. Some had slightly different shaped legs. Some had slightly longer toes. And if anything that made it suitable for these organisms to hunt for fish in the water, they were more likely to get fish and survive. And that was going on and on and on. And then it became an advantage for those who were slightly bigger, became more successful. They could, if you're a big organism in the water, you can retain your body temperature much more effectively. Bigger organisms do better in water because they don't get cold so easily. So you can see over many selection pressures, they're getting, look how small it was here down this part. It's got a little bit bigger. It's getting bigger. It's getting bigger. Not overnight. This is very slow, subtle changes taking place. All right. The other evidence we have, which is we talked about with phylogeny, we can look at biological molecules such as, again, mentioned this a few times, haven't we? Cytochrome C, the protein involved in respiration. We can look at DNA, look at RNA. We can look at their genes. So by looking at the genes, you're looking at very specific sequences of nucleotides to see if they're producing similar proteins to us. So by looking at biological molecules, if they are the same, that tells us that we either have the same ancestor or same close ancestor, or the organism has evolved from previous one. So if you were to find, if you could find a fossil which had remnants of DNA, you could look at that DNA, and if it was really, really similar, you could say, wow, we just found a fossil which tells us that we evolved from this very specific fossil. This isn't some divergence that's occurred. This is actually one of the branches of the phylogenetic tree where we're seeing this subtle changes taking place. And if the molecules are really different, well, that tells us that the divergence or the ancestor happened a long time ago. Right, so key things for this. Just know who Charles Darwin is. He didn't come up with evolution. He came up with a mechanism to explain evolution, and he called that mechanism natural selection. And then we just talked a bit about some of the evidence we have for proving that evolution, the theory of evolution, is correct. We've got fossil evidence, and we've got molecules such as DNA, proteins, so on. A lot of his work happened at the Galapagos Islands. He studied the finches. Here is our breakdown for natural selection. Natural selection isn't going to happen if there isn't variation within a population. Variation is measured by a number of different alleles, and alleles are brought about by mutations within the DNA itself. Nature is selecting those with the most suitable alleles, not necessarily the fittest, just those who are lucky enough to have that adaptation already. And our evidence are fossils and biological molecules. Don't forget to read the textbook as well and answer the essay question in the description.